professor has been a professor of the University of Quebec, Montreal, since 1986. He was initially appointed at the Department of Sociology and then the Department of History, where he has been teaching since 1989. In 1997, Gingras co-founded the Observatoire des Sciences et des Techniques, where he currently holds the position of scientific director. The OST, this observatoire, is an organization devoted to measuring science, technology, and innovation, affiliated with the Centre Interuniversitaire de Recherche de Sciences et la Technologie. 15 years after he began working at the CIRST, he became director of research in the center from 2001 to 2005, at which time he gave up the position in order to dedicate himself to the Canadian Research Chair in the History and Sociology of Science. After his first term in 2004-2011, the chair has been renewed for a second time and ending 2018. So he is a well-known sociologist in science, really a great critic of present movements. And we will hear his talk now. Please, Yves, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your invitation. So I think that Andreas asked me to open the thing because I will try to give you the framework within which I think we can understand what's going on. You mean? Here they see me, I see. Thank you. Sorry. Okay, so I will, as a sociologist of science, I've been analyzing the transformation of the scientific fields over the last 30 years. So over the last 10 years and in acceleration over the last 5 or 6 years, I've seen trends that I call moralization of science. And I will give example of that because the point is to observe how it works. And if we understand well how it works, then we could reflect about what's going on. And I call it a new politics of science because I recall that in the 1970s we had the first book by Daniel Greenberg called The Politics of Pure Science, which was explaining the development of big science after the Second World War, the role of government in this development. Then 20 years later, he came with a new book by David Dixon called The Politics of Science. And now I think that what we see here is also a new transformation, which is in fact a moralization of science done by some activist group that think that we have to moralize science according to, of course, their own values. But to understand how it's a revolution, if we accept that in the scientific field, we have to recall what was, in fact, the implicit norms of the scientific field. Of course, it's linked to the basic work of Robert Merton, who was the first sociologist of science in the 1930s and 1940s, which tried to understand what are the implicit norms in the spontaneous dynamics of scientific research. And he recalled that science aims at universalism, which means that there is no Aryan science, there's no proletarian science, there's no citizen science. There's just science, simplicitaire, as we see in philosophy. So scientific results are supposed a priori to be universal. Even though you may make a big discovery in Bordeaux, it's true everywhere. It's not that in Bordeaux it is true that. It is that I discovered in Bordeaux. And the fact that the discovery of CRISPR-Cas9 has been done by two great biologists, women who did and then get the Nobel Prize, this is not a feminist discovery. That's what it means by universal of the discovery. Anybody can do a discovery. It may be black, it may be a woman, maybe a man, but it's not characterized as a man discovery. That's implicit norms of the scientific field. The second, which is obvious, is that if we go in science, it's that we are in search for truth. As I say, if you want to make money, you go to the bank, you go to a field where you make money. If you go in science, it's not for make money. And the fundamental, the most important one is called organized skepticism. That's the fact that when you are supposed to make a discovery, be it E equal mc squared by Albert Einstein, it's not true because Albert Einstein said it. Albert Einstein said, okay, I published this in Allender Physics. Now every physicist will look at it, will see if my calculations are right, and will say, okay, it's true or it's not true. So organized skepticism is that every discovery in principle will be checked by others. This is in this way that we found a lot of bad discoveries like cold fusion. That was a good idea, but it was totally false. It was shown false by all the scientists around the world in different laboratories. So this is the implicit norms of the scientific community. Of course, every time I say that, we have to recognize that this is a regulatory ideals. There are frauds in science, there are special interests in science, there is confirmation bias in science, we all know that. But this does not show that the ideal norms are not active. In fact, they are active. So they are norms. They are not values in itself, they are norms. Norms in the sociological sense that when you break a norms, you have a sanction. And we see it in Nature a couple of months ago. There was a fraud paper, it was retracted. The guy will, in all chances, lose his job in the United States. In all chances, I think. Because there's a norm. It's not just a value, it's a norm. And of course, there are ideological prejudices, there are economic interests, there are religious beliefs and interests. Those are obstacles, but they are not negating the ideals. They are just obstacles that have to be confronted. So, the moralization, to understand how it's important today, we have to compare it with tendencies that were at work at the beginning of the century. I don't have time to develop the case of Curie, but it is very interesting. She got the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1911, and at the very time, she had an affair with Paul Langevin. Of course, in the 1910s, having an affair with a married man was not a good thing. In fact, it was forbidden by the law. And the wife of Langevin said, I will sue Marie Curie because, in fact, she sleeps with my husband. The Nobel Prize said, you know, you should not come to the ceremony to get your Nobel Prize. So they were applying a morale of the 1910s, but the great point of Marie Curie is that she wrote a brilliant letter explaining in practice exactly the norms we have just said. She wrote a letter, said, look, I got the Nobel Prize for my discovery of polonium and radium. This has nothing to do with my private life. So I will go to the ceremony and get the Nobel Prize. This letter is in fact saying what? It's saying, my discovery is universal, you give me a prize because of the dynamics of the scientific community, not because I'm a nice woman or not a nice woman. So it was the first case of moralization, but she objected to it, and she went to the meeting. The other case, which I will not develop, is very interesting also. It confirms this internationalization, is that the big scandal erupted in 1919 when, you know, the Nobel Prize during the First World War, they stopped to give the prize because there was war in Europe. So in 1919, they said, okay, we give the prize 1916, 1917, 1918 to have a backlog of winners. And they give the prize to Fritz Haber. Fritz Haber won the prize for the synthesis of ammoniac. And people said, but you know, Fritz Haber is the guy who created the first gas during the war. So he created the chemical warfare. So there was a big uproar. French scientists said, we won't go to the Nobel ceremony because this guy, the Nobel wrote a paper saying, look, Nobel Prize is about science. And science is universal. We're not meeting into the war. He made a big discovery that is very important for the development of chemistry, for the development also of I don't know what to say in English, but anyway, it's a big discovery that has to be distinguished. And in fact, he said, on the contrary, it will contribute to peace Because the war is finished, everyone on his side and on each side were defending his own country, of course. The French physicists work for the French, the Canadian physicists work for the British ones, that was war. But again, they reacted to the moralization. That's the big point. Another one, which is not well known, but it's great for sociologists, of course. In 1994, Valéry Fabricant killed his colleague at Concordia University in Montreal. So, of course, society put it in jail. He's still there, and he will be there all his life. But he is a theoretician, and so in jail he has nothing to do, of course, except to think about mathematics and engineering. So he started to write papers in 1994 and send them for publication. Of course, they got accepted because they evaluated the paper. They said, nice paper, it's a great contribution. It's published. When the paper came out, the president of Concordia University said, but that's a scandal. Valéry Fabricant killed people, and you publish his papers. Then for the first time, scientists said, what are you talking about? It's a paper, it's true, we publish it. So they started to say, and the guy said, we are in a quandary. That was his term. We are in a quandary. So after reflection, he said, but you know, science is about knowledge. Knowledge is not based on the face of the person, if he's a nice guy. You know, Einstein was not nice with his wife. So we will not publish his paper. He divorced in 1919. He gave her all his Nobel Prize, which was a nice thing, but he was not good with her. So he divorced. Do we have to take that into account? So the scientist says, no. Science is universal. The society put him in jail, but the scientific field is not the society. It's the republic of science. It's kind of a society within the society with its own norms. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm telling you that's how it works. And so they said, we're sorry, Mr. the President, we understand your grief, but this has nothing to do. And Fabricant still publishes. I checked last year, and he's now at about 70 papers, appeared in 25 different journals. And he signs, Valéry Fabricant, for my prison in Orsainville, number 25554. Okay? So that's a very concrete case where they say, okay, this guy is bizarre, but when we read his paper, it's a contribution to knowledge. Some people have a very hard time to accept that. It's okay, but I say, yeah, the community decided that it is science. Because if it's not science, then it's particularism, which will be the end of that. Okay, is the paper written by a man? Is it written by a woman, or by gay people, or by LGBTQXY? If we begin that door, of course, we have all understood that it's crazy. So for Valéry Fabricant, I think it's the worst case we can have. The guy killed his colleagues. And science has nothing to do with that. But society, of course, said the guy will be. And over the last 5 years, he asked constantly to be released. Of course, they have not released him because he's really crazy. Really crazy. So, of course, when we talk about moralization, the question to ask those people, and I will give concrete examples for that, is that which moral to apply? The one of 1910 against Marie Curie, the ones against Valéry Fabricant, which moral to apply? Norms are a different thing. And it reminds me this very nice sentence by Albert Einstein in his autobiography. He says at the very beginning, the essential in the being of a man of my type lies precisely in what he thinks and how he thinks, not in what he does or suffers. So this sentence again incarnates this idea that, okay, as a scientist, maybe you're interested in my way of thinking, not in my life. It's universalism again, expressed in his words. Now, I will explain the debates which are very interesting, that now with Twitter and Facebook, there's been a new trend to make a push to have paper retracted when the papers are in fact valid. So to understand that, I just recall that usually the reason for retracting papers is fraudulent papers, unreliable data, plagiarism, duplicate paper, of course, authorship issues. So it's a usual way to say, okay, there's a mistake in the paper, we retract the paper. But as far as I know, it has never been the case that papers have been retracted when they are right. And it's not me who will tell you that the paper is right. I will show it's the authors themselves, which is quite bizarre. So here it is. Okay, I will skip that. Here's the first example that I looked at. In November 2020, there was a paper in the journal Nature Communication called The Association Between Early Career and Formal Mentorship in Academic Collaboration and Junior Authorship Performance. Okay, this is a very complicated bibliometric analysis of co-authorship and publications and the fact that the student, the woman student, is under the direction of a man or under the direction of a woman. So they ask, okay, if your director, your thesis director is a man, how does that affect your career? And if your director is a woman, how does that affect your career in terms of publications and citations? Standard bibliometric analysis, very complicated. It's been evaluated by peers. It's been published. And the conclusion is very simple, is that if women are mentored by women, they will have less impact than if they're mentored by men. That was the conclusion. A couple of months later, the internet became crazy. People pushed to the editor Nature. They said, that's a scandal to say that this will not bring women to science. It's very absurd. November. 1 month later, I said 2 months, less than 1 month later, retracted paper by the author. So why has the paper been retracted? Of course, there could be a mistake, but let's read the argument. So that's in the retracted paper argument. The authors are retracting in response to criticism about the assumptions challenging the interpretation and conclusion. These criticisms were raised by readers and confirmed by 3 expert post-publication part of the journal. But I have to mention that the post-publication committee did not ask for retraction. They asked clarification, which is not the same. As you know, we can very often in a scientific paper add an addendum saying, okay, here, and I will give an example of that. Here I make a correction about this to clarify that, but the conclusion is said good. And later they say, although we believe that all the key findings of the paper with regards to co-authorship between junior are valid, we have concluded that the most appropriate course of action is to retract the article. And say, okay, what's going on here? Then there's another, the last paragraph. They say this. We are an interdisciplinary team of scientists with an unwavering commitment to gender equity. Deep regret that the publication of our research has both caused pain on an individual level and triggered, you know the words pain, triggered, such a profound response among many in the scientific community. Many women have personally been extremely influential in our own careers, and we express our steadfast solidarity with and support of the countless women who have been a driving force in scientific advancement. We hope the academic debate continue on how to achieve true equity in science, a debate that thrives on robust and vivid scientific exchange. This paragraph, I think, is extraordinary. They just back off and say, okay, I'm sorry, I'm for women. This has nothing to do with the data. Absolutely nothing to do with the data. So they just cave in, totally cave in. After having said the paper is good, the conclusions are good, they said, oh, you know, we work with women. And the funny thing is that it confirms an analysis I've always been promoting, that what we call valid data or robust data, this is a tautology. You accept the data only when you accept the conclusion. When you don't like the conclusion, you look at the methodology and you find always something. But the funny thing is that the three authors who are there did a paper a year before, or 2 years before, exactly the same methodology. But they concluded that the diversity of authors, a woman, a man, brings more impact on the science. Of course, nobody look at the methodology because it's a feel-good conclusion, which may be true. But then I said, wait a minute, they use the same methodology, you accept the conclusion. Now you have a conclusion you don't accept, so you put the methodology in question. But if you put the methodology in question, then you go back to the first paper. Of course, they won't do that, okay? Now, let's suppose as a sociologist of science, because I knew that paper because I've been doing bibliometrics myself for 30 years. So I happen in this particular case to know the field. If this paper, they had found that women mentored by women had more impact than women mentored by men, as a sociologist, I would have said, that's false. That's impossible. Why? For the obvious reason that over the last 30 years, 40 years, men are dominating in the field. We all know that. The women came later in the field, so they cannot be at the head of it. This is why there were very few Nobel Prize over the last 50 years. So if men are dominating everywhere, it's normal that their social networks, their international networks, is larger than that of women. So being trained and mentored by men will have more impact. I could have predicted that. So when I saw the paper, I said, it confirms basic sociology of science. But it's been retracted. So that's the first case of a very case of moralization. Here is another one, but more complex because it's based on right-wing American pro-Trump people. But again, the paper is good. It's a book about officer characteristics and racial disparities in fatal officer-involved shootings. Very big database of shooting in US. And they look at the characteristics of the police who shoot them. They say, okay, this guy is black, this guy is white, this guy is an Asian, this guy is a Latino, and they look at the correlation. And what they do is very complex because it's counterintuitive in terms of statistics. It's called how do we call that? Is that you evaluate the probability of X given H, which is different from the probability of H given X. But intuitively, it's not easy to understand. Okay? So they did the paper in July 2019. April 2020, they make a correction, which is the way to go. Some scientists said, you know, there is a sentence in your paper where the distinction between the probability of X given H is not said in a clearly enough way to distinguish it from the probability of H given X. So they said, oh, you're right. So we correct the sentence. That's it. April. So they say our articles estimated the role of officer characteristics in predicting the race of civilian fatally shot. We had erroneously made statements about the racial differences in the probability of being shot, which is the reverse case. He said, we have issued and corrected it. So it's a very simple case. They made a mistake in the sentence, not in the results. So in short, as I told you, it's P to X given H, not P to H given X. Okay, I will scrap this. They explain again the thing. It's easy. Then July, so 3 months later, they retract the whole paper. So, okay, what's going on here? Then they say, okay, despite this correction, the first that we did, our work has continued to be cited as providing support for the idea that there are no racial biases in fatal shooting, which is obvious. There is racial basis for those who are being shot. That's obvious in the States. To be clear, our work does not speak to these issues and should not be used to support such statements. We take full responsibility for not being careful enough with the inferences made in our original report, and this directly led to a misunderstanding of our paper. While our data and statistical approach were appropriate for investigating whether office characteristics are related to the race of civilians fatally shot by police, they are inadequate to address racial disparities in the probability of being shot. So they said, you look at our paper and you don't understand it. It's not what we do. Given these issues and the continued use of our work in the public debate, we have decided to retract the article. Okay? So, again, the paper is exactly right. This paper is a good paper. But it's misunderstood by right wing, and they use it to say there's no racism among the police. They say, no, it's not what we show. Okay? So they retracted it. Instead of saying, I'm sorry, that's true data, we'll explain it again and again, but don't tell us to retract it. But they retracted social pressure. Now, I found a couple of months ago a new case which is very interesting because it's a different one. It's how to avoid retraction by saying something that nobody wants to hear, which is a case I never saw. Okay. There's a big debate in Canada about residential schools, okay? From the 1940s to now, they said that the spokesperson of the autochthonous communities, the First Nations, say that the residential schools killed Indians, they massacred them, they did a lot of bad things to them. Here is our economist who take the database from the Statistics Canada about the health, about all the variables of health of those in the residential schools. And they essentially show that there is evidence that residential schools increase adult hate and increase the probability of a healthy adult, and BMI is the body mass index, which is a measure of health, and it's linked to diabetes also. For the average child who attended, given the broader social context. So their paper showed that those who were at the residential schools were better treated than those who were not. They were in better health, which is totally in contradiction with all the official discourse. So this paper could have been, attacked exactly like the one we have. But of course, they know that. So they say, we stress that these findings in no way legitimize the residential school system. Rather, they imply the conditions within the colonized environment outside of residential schools were even more adverse for some children than the conditions they face in the residential. You see, they just rhetorically reverse the thing. They say, what we show is that those who were not there were very badly treated because of colonialism. He said, no, it's not what they have shown. It's not at all what they have shown. They have shown that those in the residential school were well treated, which is exactly what cannot be said because the residential schools are where they were killing the Indians, according to the official discourse. So they revert, they said, you should not do that. And then they conclude saying that any physical health gains we attribute to residential schools need to be interpreted in the broader context of the long-term consequences of colonization and the resulting poor living condition that generates the counterfactual. We mean those who are not there. Of course, those who are not there are not treated the same way. That's totally obvious. But it's not what they have shown. So our result should be interpreted. So they say how to interpret the results. should be interpreted as an indictment of the broader colonial conditions faced by the status First Nation people during the 20th century. That's the last sentence. It's exactly the contrary of what they've shown. Exactly the contrary. But it saved them, I think, from attack and retraction. Conclusion. So the question is, should valid results be retracted on the sole basis that they conflict with the convictions of a particular group in society? Would science be more robust or more valid if it has to obey criteria external to the scientific community, dictated by self-proclaimed group, making their views known through internet and social media? And then which moral to apply? Those of some group, self-proclaimed groups who don't know where they come from, who don't know who they interpret, they have not been elected by anybody. Why should we cave in to those people? That's the question. So, given the impossibility of predicting in advance all possible users of results, can researchers be considered responsible for the results, for the use? Those who retracted the result, there's a bad use of our results, we retract them. It goes against the objective of science, which is that I make an analysis, I find the conclusions, and I live with it. Max Weber always said at the beginning of the century as a sociologist, the job of the sociologist is to analyze the work and accept the consequences, even when they are against his own and her own prejudices. Not, okay, I'm against this, I retract, or I put the data in the drawer. So the struggle, the answer to this question, of course, is part of the struggle for the autonomy of research, because all this debate about demoralization is in fact an attack on academic freedom. That's what it is. Real academic freedom is that I get results, they are not nice, but they are robust, and you have to accept the consequences of those results and then change society instead of don't want to look at the results. So in the paper on mentorship, we have to take that into account to see that it will change. I can predict that in the years to come, there will be more and more women at the top of the group, and then the differences between the mentoring of men and women will diminish. It's neither good or bad, I don't care. It's a sociological fact that you can predict in advance. Thank you for your attention.
So are there questions? Any questions who people want to raise? So maybe I can start with one. There has been the claim, Godal, for instance, people say that the research on monkeys and stuff like this is a feminist thing. It's mainly women who had the sensitivity to look on, so in that era, especially the role of female monkeys. So what's your, and they say, these people claim that in fact this research would not have been done if there would be only men.
Okay.
So what's your...
I think that if that's not as complicated as people may think, in terms of the real sense of diversity, okay, the diversity is about the choice of topics. For example, if I did history of physics, it's because I was trained in physics as a physicist. Okay, so even my colleague who is a historian of biology is because he's been trained in biology. So the choice depends on your private history. If you come from I have colleagues in the history department who are from working class origins. They look at working class people. Some do history of women. So the choice of topics is the context of research. It's not the context of justification. The context of justification is universal. If you're a woman working on monkeys, it's nice. When you publish your papers, everyone will look at it, men, women, black, Indians, and they will say you're right or wrong on your conclusion on that. So I think it's a false problem, and the danger of it, of course, it's the contradiction of essentialism. To say that women were particularly good at something is essentializing all women. It's like all Quebecers would be like me. Of course, there's no essentialism. So the diversity is one of looking at different problems, and it's obvious for sociologists. In the 1950s, in the history department, there were history of industry, there were history of capitalism, there was no history of women. Of course, history of women appeared in the 60s and 70s. Now it's everywhere. Why? Because in university, the percentage of women at the BA is now a majority. Of course, the interest of the topic. So it's the contingency of social sciences that makes history of science, for example, has been invented after the war because of the atomic bomb. There was no department of history of science in the world before 1945. Why? Because we understood only after the war that science in society is something very crucial now, and we have to do history and sociology of science. So any topics about anything is legitimate, but not based on essentialism, but on personal choices of each of us. And we have to accept that as the context of research. And then the context of discovery, there's only one thing, it's skepticism and decorticating the arguments of the paper, not looking at the name of the author. Valéry Fabricant is crazy, but his papers are very good in mathematical physics. So what can we say about it? We have to publish the paper. Same thing with the women who think they are the best in the field. We'll see when we read the paper.
Okay, so any other? Yes.
Hello, I have a question. So you mentioned about the ethics. We have a crazy person, but he does good science, so it's fine. Person did good science, then he did something during the war, but he still did good science. But would you agree that there still should be a morality to science in terms of how he got the data? If during his experiments he did something bad or cruel, then maybe in that case we shouldn't accept the data. Would you agree with that?
I know, in fact, this, as you know, happened with Mengele, and at the end of the Second World War, there was the conference who defined the first ethics of research, because under the Nazi, they used people to understand how they resist in cold water, and there was a big debate among the scientists themselves, saying that we should not use that. But some others said, well, but the data are the data. And I can bet you anytime that in practice, government, the army, certainly use some of those data. Because when the war was finished, they took Werner von Braun, who was a Nazi who created V1 and V2 and bombed and they said, okay, you're a nice guy because you will do now the rockets for us. Okay, so it's a very difficult case, but if we look at the pure objectivity of the data were good for this particular ill-defined problems. Okay, so it's a real problem. But I'm sure some use the data after the war, but they said we should not use that. Okay, so the real thing is that, is it useful to use it? Most of the time not, but if it's useful, you can be sure they will use it. I'm sure of that, because they will be in a quandary saying that if I use that, I solve another problem. I will not tell that I use the data that the Nazi created, but I will do it. So it's a real problem that will be solved only by the problem with morality, as distinct from the norms, is that it's a personal choice. For example, when the guy stopped doing research on babies, I said it's nice for him, but others did the research, and now we have in vitro baby by thousands, and it's accepted. But at the time, it was a moral quandary. But the moral quandary is individual, not collective. The only thing in science is the norms. If you are on the norms, the data will be valid. Now, do you want to use them? It's a moral, individual choice.
Okay, so just if you have one quick question.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. So I think, there is, in my mind, there's not really a big problem as long as we really dissociate the science from the person who did the science, right? So we can celebrate the science if it's good data, if it brings us ahead and advances our technology and so on. well then let's do that, but not celebrate the scientist. If he or she was a nasty person, then let's be frank about it. And I think as long as, I mean, sometimes it's maybe hard to distinguish this a little bit, but if we try, do a nice separation, problem is more or less solved, I think.
It's what happened a couple of years ago when a laboratory was named after one of the discoverers of DNA, who in his last year was really seeing racist discourse. So they changed the name of the laboratory. This can be accepted even for sociological reasons, because when you give the name of the laboratory, it's for the symbolic capital of the person. You say, okay, that's the laboratory of James Crick. But now James Crick has a bad aura, so you don't want to call it that way, so they changed the name of the laboratory. Because as you said, it was about using his credibility as an individual with the name Francis Crick or Watson.
It was Watson, I think, actually.
Yeah, I'm sorry, yes, Watson. And they said the Watson lab, they changed the name. Because it was good at a certain time and bad at the other time.
Yeah.
You know, same with Einstein. There was a New York Times article when they published a journal that the diary that Einstein had during his visit to Japan and China, you know, he wrote what is perceived now as racist comments on the Chinese. So I say it's always dangerous to name an individual, because in a couple of years you can find it was bad with his children or his wife or whatever it did. So it's a problem to use the name of the people, because now with the moralization, you have to be perfect. And nobody is perfect, not even Marie Curie.